Well, good morning, everyone. If we can all take a seat, we can get started. God. All right, that's the easiest that's ever happened in this room. That means things are going to go well today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm MAUREEN ZAREMBA, Curator of Education at the John and Mable Ringling Museum of Art. And on behalf of the staff, it gives us great pleasure to welcome you to the Symposium on Peter Paul Rubens' Eucharist series. Coincidentally, as our director mentioned last night, it is almost exactly 30 years to the date of the museum's last symposium on Rubens, which was held in April of 1882. Boy, 1982. And we've got this volume to prove it. So it's high time we paid attention to the work of this Baroque master who is at the heart of the museum's collections. And now at last evening's keynote address, I took a moment to thank my colleagues at FSU and at the museum whose efforts have made this program possible. For those of you who weren't in attendance at last night's proceedings, it bears repeating. And you can count them. Accounting, admissions, curatorial, development, education, events, guest services, historic Oslo theater, human resources, IT, marketing, preparation, registration, security, and visitor services. And yes, it does take a village. We're pleased to welcome back to the museum Alexandra Libby, the museum's former assistant curator of European art, who was involved in the initial planning of this project. Miss Libby left the museum to pursue a Ph.D. in art history at the University of Maryland, but has returned today to share her enthusiasm and expertise as our discussion moderator. I should mention that her Ph.D. project involves the Eucharist series. Very special thanks go out to my fellow educators whose organizational skills, teamwork, and most of all, their sense of humor were instrumental in producing this program. Now, good planning is only one aspect of producing a good program. Great content makes it compelling and engaging and creates a meaningful body of knowledge that will be used by an international community of scholars and students. So we are very grateful to the scholars, almost all who have traveled a great distance to present at this symposium. This program brings together some of the world's leading experts on Rubens who have been more than generous in sharing their time and expertise. We look forward to new insights and new perspectives on these remarkable works by a remarkable artist. Now, as a state institution, we have some financial challenges. We just have to work smarter. So we planned these events during Florida's winter so we can lure these people here with the promise of balmy weather and drinks with names like Pina Colada, decorated with little parasols. Now, it's no contest for our colleagues up north or in Europe, but it's a harder sell for colleagues from California. However, we know California's had some really bad weather lately, so that worked to our advantage. And it's the audience's responsibility to pray for great weather over the next couple of days. I would like particularly to acknowledge our colleague, Dr. Virginia Brilliant, the museum's curator of European art before 1850, whose research, scholarship, and publication on the Rubens works in this Ringling collection has inspired this symposium. Without her passion and leadership, this program would never have happened. Thank you, Virginia. Now, a few words about procedures. You can see that the program is divided into discrete topics consisting of 2 papers. Worked out really well. We have allotted 30 minutes for each paper. A discussion period will occur at the conclusion of each session, so audience, please hold your questions until that time. The presenters will be invited up to the front of the room to respond to questions posed by Ms. Libby and by the audience. And if you are in the audience, we're going to ask you to step up to the mic. So please feel free to help yourself to the beverage service located in the classroom. And restrooms are located in the lobby of the Education Center right outside the door. This is a live webcast. So feel free to call mom, dad, friends, family, tell them to log on. They just need to go to the museum's website, go to our home page. They'll find a button for Rubens Symposium. That will take you to the Rubens Symposium page, and there on the bottom is the direct link to the live webcast. Many of you have asked, this will eventually be archived and will be available for future resources. So with that, let's begin. And where better to begin than at the beginning, with a welcome and introduction to the focus of this symposium, Rubens' Triumph of the Eucharist series. Virginia Brilliant is Curator of European Art here at the John and Mable Ringling Museum of Art. To date, she has been the lead curator for the exhibitions The Triumph of Marriage, Painted Cassoni of the Renaissance, Gothic Art in the Gilded Age, Medieval and Renaissance Treasures in the Gave Vanderbilt Ringling Collection, and Peter Paul Rubens, Impressions of a Master. Paolo Veronese, a master and his workshop in Renaissance Venice, will open this December at the museum. Virginia.
Okay, thank you, Maureen. Good morning, everyone. Now, Maureen actually has a great job today. She gets to introduce all of the wonderful scholars who are joining us from around the world to talk about some of the great works in our collection here at the Ringling. But none of this would be possible, and none of you would be here at all, and none of the PowerPoints would be formatted in a way that was appropriate for the webcast if it weren't for Maureen and her colleagues in the Education Department, particular Barbara Hyde and Sonia Kita, who organized and facilitated every last detail of this remarkable weekend. Everyone tells me that I'm so incredibly lucky to work with the great collection that we have here at the Ringling, but I always think that my real good fortune is to have fabulous colleagues who are so dedicated to working with me to share that collection and the growing body of knowledge about it with our public. So let us all pause and give a huge round of applause as thanks to my partners in learningfulness, Maureen and her extraordinary team. Yes, we do know learningfulness is not actually a word, but it is here. In the spring of 1926, the circus impresario, financier, and budding art collector John Ringling visited Europe with the German art dealer Julius Böhler in search of old master paintings for his planned art museum in Sarasota, Florida. Their last stop in May was London, where they visited Grosvenor House, the residence of the Duke of Westminster. The Duke was offering for sale 4 immense canvases by the Flemish master Peter Paul Rubens. As Böhler later recalled, quote, "We went to Grosvenor House, and he, Ringling, liked them immensely. Afterward, he said to me, 'Look here, we must buy those pictures.' I protested, but he insisted, saying that those 4 paintings would make his museum look like one of the old museums in Europe, and that no American museum had anything similar," which was quite true. He said he would have a big room built especially for them, and they would look wonderful. Mr. Ringling was so enthusiastic that I felt compelled to buy the canvases. He visualized what they would do for the museum as I, at the moment, didn't, unquote. The 4 paintings had originally belonged to the Infanta Isabella Clara Eugenia, daughter of Philip II, King of Spain, and regent of the Spanish Netherlands, and were considered at the time to be full-scale models or cartoons for tapestries that the Infanta had commissioned from Rubens in the 1620s. The canvases, along with 3 others, had been sent to Spain after the Infanta's death, thus saving them from a fire in her former palace in Brussels in 1731 that destroyed other large paintings relating to the series. The Duke had offered 3 of the enormous pedigreed works for sale at an auction in Christie's in London in 1924, but the 14-foot-tall canvases, hardly over-the-sofa pictures that private collectors could display easily in their homes, had failed to sell. Böhler was also shocked that the Duke was asking £20,000 for the works, especially since 2 had been offered for £650 and 1 for £1,000 in the 1924 sale. Moreover, and we heard a lot about this last night if you were here, while Rubens's works were admired and sought after for centuries following his death, often by the most discriminating collectors, late 19th and early 20th century American collectors had not, for the most part, shared this enthusiasm and had largely neglected Rubens as they formed their old master collections. Yet Ringling would not be dissuaded, either by the size of the works, their now exorbitant price, or the fact that they were unfashionable, out of step with the taste of the millionaire collectors of the Gilded Age to whose greatness he aspired. Instead, in the massive pictures he had seen in Grosvenor House, he saw an opportunity to create in Sarasota his own Louvre, with its 24 large-scale paintings by Rubens devoted to the life of Marie de' Medici, or his own Rubens gallery in the manner of the princes of Liechtenstein in their garden palace in the Rossau in Vienna, which housed paintings relating to another of Rubens's tapestry series, or even his own Victoria and Albert Museum, home to the British royal family's tapestry cartoons, not by Rubens this time, but by Raphael. So thanks to Ringling's great foresight in making this transformative purchase, followed by the acquisition of several more pictures by the artist, the Ringling Museum became synonymous with Rubens for art enthusiasts the world over. Thus, it is fitting that we are gathered here together today at John Ringling's Museum to celebrate and re-examine Rubens's Triumph of the Eucharist series. No American setting could be more fitting for such an enterprise. As Maureen and others have said, exactly 30 years have passed since the Ringling's last symposium devoted to the art of Peter Paul Rubens. This was a gathering of great luminaries in the cosmos of Rubens scholarship. And some of the participants those participants are, to our great delight, with us again today. I'm told also that at that event, it's maybe an apocryphal legend, that the late great Rubens scholars Julius Held and Michael Jaffe had a fist fight in the swimming pool. I do hope that our discussion here today is as spirited. Not quite as spirited. Yet to come back to our topic at hand, even more than 30 years have passed since the publication of Nora DePorter's magisterial Corpus Rubenianum volume on the Eucharist series, as well as Charles Scribner's book devoted to the same subject. The time has definitely come for new research and perspectives for the work of another generation of scholars. Over the course of the day, we will hear papers shedding new light on the making and meaning of the series, on its artist, Rubens, on its patron, the Infanta Isabella Clara Eugenia, and on the rich cultural, social, and ritual context which incited the series' creation and informed its reception. But before we delve deeper, I will offer a brief introduction to the series and some of my own thoughts, which I expect all of our speakers will elaborate on and even debunk. On the 10th of July, 1625, the Infanta Isabella Clara Eugenia, daughter of Philip II of Spain and governor of the Spanish Netherlands, visited the Antwerp studio of Rubens, her court painter and advisor. On the occasion of that visit, only a few days after the Spanish victory over Dutch forces at the Battle of Breda, the Infanta posed for a curious portrait. Rather than presenting herself in traditional court dress, she chose to have herself portrayed in the habit of the Order of the Poor Clares, which she had donned following the death of her husband, Archduke Albrecht, in 1621. It is thought that on the same day, perhaps as an expression of gratitude to God for the Spanish victory, the Infanta commissioned from Rubens 20 tapestries destined for the convent of the Descalzas Reales in Madrid. The convent of the Descalzas Reales held a special place in the heart of the Infanta, who was named after and born on the feast day of St. Clare, foundress of the order of nuns residing there. Founded in 1556 by Isabella's aunt, the Infanta Juana, the convent was also the burial place of her mother, Elizabeth of Valois, and the residence of several female relatives. Isabella had lived at the convent during several periods in her youth and hoped to retire there. The tapestries might have been conceived in part as a sort of preemptive dowry for this withdrawal from the world. Political events and the wishes of her nephew Philip IV that she remain in the southern Netherlands prevented the Infanta from realizing this dream, and when she died in Brussels in 1633, she had not seen her beloved native Spain in 34 years, more than half her life. With this lavish gift, which conspicuously contained her portrait, the Infanta not only expressed her strong attachment to the convent, but also made herself and her beliefs present there in perpetuity. And indeed, the entire tapestry series is preserved intact at the convent today. One of the largest and most valuable gifts ever made to the Descalzas Reales, the tapestries were designed to embellish the convent during feast day celebrations associated with the Eucharist. According to Catholic doctrine, Christ instituted the sacrament of the Eucharist at the Last Supper. The Eucharist contains the body and blood, soul and divinity of Jesus Christ under the appearances of bread and wine in Roman Catholic belief. Only ordained priests can consecrate the bread and wine so that their substance is changed into the body and blood of Christ. Veneration of the Eucharist was fundamental to the Habsburgs and throughout Spain, and challenges by Protestant reformers spurred Catholic devotion to the Blessed Sacrament during the Counter-Reformation. The Infanta Juana instituted sumptuous celebrations of the Eucharistic feasts of the Entombment, the Resurrection, or Easter, coming up, and Corpus Christi. These celebrations were the culmination of devotional and ritual life at the royal convent. The Infanta Isabella spent formative years at the convent and intimately understood the religious foundation and its rituals. Youthful experiences must have been very moving, strengthening her devotion to the Eucharist and her faith more broadly. Unlike most women of her station, she was not merely placed in an advantageous dynastic marriage, but was entrusted, along with her husband, with the burden of upholding Spanish rule in the turbulent Netherlands and promoting the tenets of the Catholic reform there by her father Philip II. Her reign was characterized by a steadfast insistence upon Catholic orthodoxy and marked by forceful interventions into the religious lives of her subjects. The subject matter of the series thus demonstrates Isabella's awareness of and staunch devotion to her own political, dynastic, and historical responsibilities as a defender of the faith, a role of which Rubens, her devoutly Catholic confidant, who was responsible for creating the public face of her rule in the Netherlands, would have been deeply conscious. During the Eucharistic feast, at least some of the tapestries were placed in the convent church. Some may also have been hung in one of the convent's cloisters or on the building's facade during related processions. Here below, I show you an image not of the Descalces, but of the facade of the Cathedral of Toledo, hung with tapestries during the procession of the Most Holy Sacrament on Corpus Christi. And some of these, you may notice, are from another set of Triumph of the Eucharist tapestries. Taken together, the scenes in the tapestries appropriately comprise a procession of holy figures, triumphal cars, and dynamic narratives which at once mirror, sanction, and partake in the pageantry that would have occurred before them. Out of doors, the wind and sunshine would have intensified the movement and color of the woven cortege, and you get a little bit of a sense of that in the picture below. Inside the church, the tapestries were probably installed in a two-tiered arrangement, covering both walls of the nave as well as the altar wall and the one opposite, into which the grille of the nuns' choir is set. A painted sketch now in the Art Institute of Chicago records the way in which Rubens wished to display 5 of the pieces, and you can get a sense of the two-tiered arrangement from this. The precise placement of the tapestries within the space has proved difficult to determine, as radical rebuilding of the church in the 18th century has obscured its original appearance. Several intriguing proposals have been made by scholars, and I know we were going to hear a lot more about this today. As for their subjects, 4 tapestries depict Old Testament prefigurations of the Eucharist: the meeting of Abraham and Melchizedek, Elijah and the angel, the gathering of the manna, and the sacrifice of the Old Covenant. 2 more show allegorical victories of the sacrament over paganism and heresy. 2 more portray apostles and saints. And 3 present splendid triumphal processions: the triumph of faith, the triumph of divine love, and the triumph of the church. As we saw in the Chicago sketch, 5 other tapestries created a unified composition in which the Eucharist is adored and celebrated by religious and secular rulers and angels. And here we have the Chicago sketch juxtaposed with the tapestries in that arrangement. 4 other pieces represent allegories and personifications and have borders that look like picture frames. Finally, we have a piece showing David with the harp, which may have surmounted the Adoration Ensemble. It has been suggested that the 11 largest hangings, here shown in no particular order, would have evoked the 11 curtains of the Jewish tabernacle surrounding the sanctuary when hung inside the convent church. The tapestries would thus have denoted the transformation of the traditional Jewish holy space into a Christian one, where God's Eucharistic presence has supplanted the Ark of the Covenant. The Solomonic columns in some of the tapestries, so the twisty columns that you can see in some of them, in some of the tapestries, yes, recall the columns that were brought from the Temple of Jerusalem, or the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, to St. Peter's in Rome. Thus, in the chapel hung with Rubens' tapestries, this long-lost Holy of Holies would be, in a sense, recovered in a new Christian identity. Such themes of transformation and continuity seem to permeate the series. Indeed, they were fundamental to the meaning of the Eucharist, to the reinforcement and vindication of Catholic doctrine during the Counter-Reformation, to the manufacture of tapestries based on designs worked out in oil paintings, and to the intellectual and visual structures of typology, whereby events in the Old or in the New Testament and points of Christian belief are prefigured by incidents in the Old Testament. Did I just get that backwards? Things in the New Testament are prefigured by things in the Old Testament, yeah. And sorry, it's early still. I haven't had enough caffeine. And allegory, the illustration of abstract concepts through personifications and symbols that Rubens used to articulate and celebrate this essential tenet of Catholic faith and the Church as a whole, triumphant. In the series, Rubens cleverly altered the conventions of tapestry design. Instead of framing the central images with squared decorative borders, the weavings feature fictive tapestries displayed within fictive architectural settings. Thus, the actual architecture of the church would have been replaced by a different woven architecture upon which tapestries, or rather tapestries within tapestries, are hung. In his designs for two previous tapestry series devoted to the histories of Decius Mus and the Emperor Constantine, Rubens, as was typical of tapestry designers at the time, left the choice of borders to the weavers. And here we can see one of the pieces from the Constantine series, so you can see the difference. Tapestry manufacturers maintained stocks of border patterns, typically ornamented with fruited and or flowered garlands, frolicking putti, animals, grotesques, and symbolic or allegorical figures, like personifications of virtues or seasons. With the Eucharist series Tapestries Within Tapestries, Rubens made a drastic break with this tradition. Indeed, Rubens's Eucharist tapestries are full of tricks of the eye. In addition to the tapestries within tapestries and the tapestry's fictive architecture overlapping the church's real architecture, figures throughout are also poised at once in more than one pictorial field. A prime example can be seen here, where one cannot tell if the two foreground figures outlined here in red are part of the framing or the background architecture. You can see this on the slide, but I really urge you to go in the gallery and look at this because it's really interesting. So they emerge from just behind the architecture of the border, the sort of stage set into which the fictive tapestry is then unfurled. But their jugs are destined for the scene taking place on the fictive tapestry, whose own architectural background is independent from that of the frame. So you can see there's a framing architecture, and then there's the architecture that's occurring on this sort of tapestry within the tapestry. And I'm not allowed to point at the slides because of the webcast, but if I did, I could go over there and point. But so we can all do this later in the gallery. So through these illusions, the tapestries became a sort of permeable world that is no mere backdrop to the processions and celebrations that took place in the church or the cloister. Rather, the real and depicted processions and celebrations would have merged, in a sense, in the eye of the beholder, both real and represented participants joining together in and reinforcing each other's veneration of the Eucharist. It is fitting, too, that Rubens would have challenged viewers to reflect on the real and the invisible. These ideas were certainly topical for a cycle that upheld the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Just as the Last Supper must be repeatedly and ritually reenacted in the sacrament of the Eucharist, so too did Rubens's dazzling illusions remain perpetually unresolved in the eye of the beholder. In preparation for the cycle, Rubens first produced bozzetti, small-scale oil sketches on wooden panels reflecting his initial ideas for the scenes in the series. The bozzetti are generally agreed to be autograph works, effectively painted drawings in which Rubens's hand quickly gave form to thought. Executed to offer viewers the essential ideas of the intended result, they may have been shown to the Infanta or her advisors, whereupon compositions, subject matter, and the overall installation of the series in the church could be discussed, refined, and altered in the next phase of design. Next came modelli, larger, more detailed, more highly finished oil paintings on wooden panels, showing each composition at 4 times the size of the bozzetto, thus 60 or 70 centimeters high. In the modelli, the compositions, forms, figures, and colors were finalized. And actually, if you have a really keen eye, you can see that there was a figure added between the bozzetto and the modello in this case. Modelli chiefly served as working designs for the cartoons, full-scale models for the tapestries, and were executed in reverse of the bozzetti. It is generally agreed that Rubens himself executed the modelli for the Eucharist series. Rubens, along with his workshop assistants and associates, also created enormous and vividly colored paintings in oil on canvas based on the modelli. 8 times as large as the modelli, the biggest canvases measure close to 5 meters high and 7 meters wide, and like the modelli, were conceived as mirror images of the finished tapestries. Only 7 of these large canvases have survived. 2 are on long-term loan to the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Valenciennes from the Louvre, and 5 are in the collection of the Ringling Museum. I've just realized that the next set of pages of my talk has disappeared off the podium. Maureen, did you take them? I'm sorry, I'm having a total malfunction. I had them here this morning. I don't know what to do. I'm so sorry. You do. I'm on page sort of 9. I tweaked it yesterday, but I don't know where it went. It was here. I had it this morning. Thank you. Okay. That's embarrassing. It's never happened to me before. Oh, my God. Whew. Okay. I'm actually sweating. These large canvases have long been riddled with questions of authorship. Rubens alone simply could not have executed such a great number of gargantuan canvases in the short time in which they seem to have been produced. Scholars all generally agree on this point, but have disagreed about Rubens' share in the work. While discussions of authorship are perhaps best saved until we can gather in front of the works themselves again, I would like to mention that during my own close first-hand examination of the canvases, lots of rickety lifts up into the galleries, very scary, I believed it was possible to discern Rubens' hand in the faces of some of the central figures in each canvas. These faces were executed with decided painterly flourish, and a high degree of psychological intensity has been achieved in them. As important figures that anchor and are focal points of the compositions, these were logical places for him to intervene. Traces of Rubens' hand can perhaps also be seen in some of the lower border areas of the canvases, as these would have been the only parts of the works visible at eye level, as they are today. It seems not totally unreasonable to suggest that Rubens would have lent his brush to them. Whatever the case, the overall visual coherence of the works reminds us that Rubens excelled at directing a large and busy workshop. The tapestries themselves were created in several Brussels workshops, including 2 of the city's most famous ateliers, those of Jan Rees and Jacob Goebbels, and of 2 lesser-known masters, Jacques Faubert and Hans Verfurth, and I'm sorry, Kuhn, that I've mispronounced this hideously. Production began in 1627, and at least some of the completed tapestries embarked on their journey for Spain on the 19th of July, 1628. I'd like to spend just a little more time discussing the large canvases. As I mentioned at the very beginning of my talk, it has always been assumed that these paintings were cartoons. This term derives from the Italian cartone, the word used to describe a full-scale, now I have to switch to the other script, a sheet containing a full-scale preparatory design for a work in a different medium, or ostensibly, in this case, complete, full-size, fully colored models for tapestries painted in oil on canvas. Yet how or even if the large canvases were used in the weaving process remains an open question. If they had been made for use in a high warp loom, their compositions would have faced in the same direction as the finished tapestries, which they do not. For use on a low warp loom, the canvases would need to be made in reverse of the tapestries, which they are, but they would have been cut into strips and fed into the loom, which was clearly not the fate of our large canvases. Modelli executed in reverse of bozzetti, as the ones for this series are, seem to anticipate paper cartoons made to be cut up and used on a low warp loom. Cartoons painted in oil on canvas were highly unusual at this date. For his Constantine and Achilles series, Rubens only created more standard paper cartoons. While he did paint large oil-on-canvas paintings reflecting his designs for the Decius-Mus cycle, he also seems to have made paper cartoons. There is evidence that paper cartoons may also have been made for the Eucharist series. So, if they were not essential working tools for the weavers, which seems likely, why did Rubens create these vast canvases? While Rubens was paid 30,000 guilders for the design of the series, the Infanta also gave Rubens an unspecified number of pearls in exchange for the paintings. I'd like to be paid in pearls. Stephen, can we work that out? Suggesting that both artist and patron viewed the tapestries and the large canvases as separate, if related, artistic undertakings. Moreover, the canvases were ultimately transported to and presumably displayed in the Infanta's palace in Brussels. Little is known of the actual installation of the works, but the desire on the part of the Infanta to own and display at least some of the canvases might be compared to the cycle of 21 large paintings Rubens created in the early 1620s for the Infanta's contemporary, the Queen Mother of France, Marie de Medici, for the Luxembourg Palace in Paris. And we saw those pieces in their current or their later installation in the Louvre earlier. Yet while Marie's canvases were scenes glorifying her somewhat spotty life, the Infanta's works would have been a splendid record of her extraordinary donation to the Descalzas Reales in faraway Madrid, as well as a demonstration of her loyalty to Habsburg Spain and her devotion to her church and its core doctrine. Cartoons were valuable commodities frequently passed down through successive generations of workshop managers and tapestry-making families, or transferred from one family to another through marriage, trade, or purchase. But they were typically valuable to the weavers, who would use them to make further versions of tapestries. They did not normally interest the owners of the finished products. One notable exception are the tapestry cartoons designed and painted in body color on paper by Raphael for a set of 10 tapestries known as the Acts of the Apostles, commissioned by Pope Leo X for the Sistine Chapel, and now in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. Rubens had more than one chance to study these famous works, which had belonged to his patrons, the Gonzaga Dukes of Mantua, and were acquired in 1623 in Genoa by the Prince of Wales, who later became Charles I, perhaps with Rubens acting as an agent in the sale. Rubens doubtless admired the painterly skill of Raphael's cartoons, but he also surely recognized that while their value resided initially in their role as working tools, they had nonetheless, thanks to the fame of their creator, quickly established themselves as works of art in their own right, and exalted ones at that, coveted by great princely collectors. Yet Rubens must also have been acutely aware of the cartoons' fragility and the inherently fugitive nature of their materials, not to mention that of the tapestries themselves, which would fade over time. The Flemish painter deeply admired Raphael, but he may also have felt more than a tiny hint of competition. Perhaps when Rubens was entrusted with the task of creating the Eucharist and before them the Decius-Mus tapestries, he thought of the Raphael cartoons and convinced his patrons to allow him to create separate second sets of cartoons that were not really cartoons at all, but rather independent records of the commission, which were sturdy, allowed him to execute his energetic compositions in the oil paint that he handled with more assuredly than any other medium, and were also eminently collectible. Thus, Rubens might have deliberately sought to surpass Raphael's cartoons, creating durable works that would not only hold a high value for a princely patron, but also physically withstand the tests of time. And such an idea must have been particularly, I think, appealing to the Infanta, whose tapestries, as soon as they were made, were sent to faraway Spain. This way she could keep a piece of them, for herself in Brussels. I've spoken very little so far about the content or iconography of the individual scenes included in the Eucharist series, and I expect we'll hear more about this throughout the day. But before I conclude, I'd like to pause for a moment on the central figure in the composition, showing the composition of the Defenders of the Eucharist, in which Rubens presents 7 saints known for their devotion to or defense of the Eucharist, as part of the series' triumphal processions, sort of part of the entourage. So here at the center, we see St. Clare of Assisi, the patron saint of the Descalzas and founder of its order of nuns. She triumphantly wields a great golden monstrance housing the Eucharist. This attribute refers to a miracle St. Clare performed in order to save her convent from a band of Saracen marauders, mercenaries in the service of the Emperor Frederick II in his war against the Pope. Then an old woman, she arose from her sickbed, took the sacrament to the window, and raised it before the soldiers climbing the convent's walls. They fell back and took flight, and the convent was saved. I wish you could just, do that today. It would be quite fun. In any case, the registrars won't let me pick up the monstrances, though. Clare's features, though, are those of Isabella Clara Eugenia, closely matching the portrait she sat for when she supposedly commissioned the series. As such, Rubens accorded the Infanta, his patron and friend, the highest possible place of honor in the series she commissioned. She's not only surrounded by 4 doctors of the Church and an important Eucharistic saint, but she alone is entrusted with the monstrance containing the host and thus becomes their natural successor in this uninterrupted sequence, the heir to the cause, its present and preeminent proponent. The Infanta is also equated with the triumphant monstrance-bearing personification of Ecclesia in the Triumph of the Church, the little red box around it here, which is arguably the culmination of the series. So Isabella and the Church become visually one and the same. Isabella, furthermore, stands in a privileged position directly beneath the dove of the Holy Spirit, from which emanates divine golden light. Light plays a key role throughout the series. Just in the Ringling canvases, details of which you see here, we see an oil lamp below the defenders and torches wielded by Putti in the Triumph of Divine Love, Moses' radiant horns and the sun medallion around Thomas Aquinas' neck, the heavenly light glowing behind the falling manna, behind Divine Love's head, behind Matthew's angel, and behind the dove, of course, above Isabella. This persistent imagery of light may be seen as having an etymological relationship with the Infanta herself. To shed light upon, to illuminate, to enlighten, is to create clarity, to make something clear. In Spanish, Anna, I'm sorry, I'm going to mispronounce something. The word is, aclarar. Now it's gone. Aclarar, yes? Okay, I didn't do too bad. And the name, of course, Clare or Clara, stems directly from this word. So the one who bears clarity as her name is a bearer of light. So the Infanta, by championing the Church and its doctrines, bears the light of divine wisdom that drives out the darkness of heresy, and on earth shines forth with the light of the world, Christ, who drives out original sin. She makes things clear. She is herself clarity, and thus truth. By including her in the series thus, Rubens gave the Infanta an active part in the celebrations of the Eucharist, or the celebrations of the Eucharist in the convent of the Descalces Reales. Isabella, we believe to her great sorrow, never returned to Spain after being sent to the southern Netherlands, yet she sent this portrait, a poignant memento of herself and her beliefs, home in her stead. By means of this image, she was ever present in the place she loved, not simply proclaiming, but verily embodying the faith she held dear. Today we hope to shed a little bit of our own light on Isabella and on her great artistic legacy, the Eucharist series. Thank you.
All right, it takes 2 of us, So thank you, Virginia, for setting the scene. So we come to our first topic of the day, art in an era of reform, which really speaks to the broader contextual milieu of the works. And our first presenter, Anne Woollett, is curator in the Department of Painting, specializing in Northern painting before 1700 at the J. Paul Getty Museum. She has lectured and published on late 16th century Flemish painting, Rembrandt, and of course Peter Paul Rubens. That's a prerequisite if you haven't figured that out yet. She has organized several exhibitions with wonderful accompanying catalogs, including Rubens and Bruegel, A Working Friendship, and coming soon, Drama and Devotion, Heemskerk's Ecce Homo altarpiece from Warsaw. And she coordinated the initiative Rembrandt in Southern California. Anne.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much, Maureen. And before I get started, I want to thank Virginia, Maureen, and Barbara so much for their warm welcome. I may come from a warm climate, but I will very happily come back to Sarasota, so I look forward to seeing you in the future. Well, as we've just heard, the supremely beautiful and trenchant series of tapestries celebrating the triumph of the Eucharist were arguably among the most important artistic endeavors of Archduchess Isabella's reign. For Rubens, the painter Isabella and her late husband Albert had masterfully bound with quote-unquote golden fetters to their court almost 20 years earlier the theological allegories for his adored patroness represented the most significant commission from her to date. Spectacular, expensive, and portable, tapestries had long served as a highly effective medium for transmitting complex allegorical programs with political, religious, and secular themes. The innovative weavings given by Isabella to the convent of the Discalced Carmelites represent a complex mixture of piety, political agenda, and artistic rivalry. Isabella's sympathetic relationship with Rubens, at that time the most influential arbiter of Catholic visual ideals, gave influential form to complex ideas of spirituality and Spanish authority. Rubens's meticulous preparatory process not only enabled Isabella to approve his designs, but it required the creation of the splendid full-scale cartoons, which are a privilege to view here at the Ringling Museum. This portrait of Isabella, which we've just seen, dates from the earliest stages of the Eucharist series. As Virginia has told us, the Archduchess Isabella had visited Rubens in Antwerp on July 10th, and both this likeness and the tenor of the tapestry series exemplify her state persona as she chose to define it. Isabella had just returned from Breda and the Spanish victory over Dutch forces, and was savoring a rare moment of satisfaction. For the last 2.5 decades, on behalf of the King of Spain, she had intensively pursued the establishment of a Catholic state that would reunite all of the provinces of the Netherlands. Along with territorial battles, Isabella and her husband engaged in a policy of militant Catholicism, working tirelessly to implement the decrees of the Council of Trent. The council was a series of 25 sessions convened by the Roman Catholic Church between 1545 and 1563, during which time perceived Protestant heresies were condemned and church teachings in key areas, including the Eucharist and the Mass and veneration of saints, was refined. For our discussion here, the decree of the Third Council in December 1563 on religious imagery, which was called in response to concerns about the abuse of church art, is particularly important. It ultimately stimulated new levels of splendor in church decoration and ceremony. Isabella's rule featured displays of personal devoutness which successfully connected her with the populace. In this portrait, Rubens powerfully articulates Isabella's deep piety and modesty through the restricted palette and slight turn of the body away from the viewer. She wears the sober brown-gray, rough wool habit of a poor Clare that she had adopted following the death of Archduke Albert in July 1621. Against the shimmering backdrop of a velvet curtain, Isabella's solid, round form suggests steadfastness and solidity. The crisp white linen and encompassing black of her habit serve as a foil for a disarmingly steady, measured gaze. As Virginia has just noted, this likeness served as the basis for Isabella in the role of St. Clare of Assisi, the patron saint of the Discalces, bearing the Eucharist in the Defenders of the Eucharist. Now, official portraits, even those painted by artists of long acquaintance, present a partial, highly constructed idea of the sitter. Rubens's painting conveys Isabella's lively personality in this mature portrait through her appraising look at the viewer. This aspect of Isabella's forceful character engaged Rubens's predecessors too, and surmounted even the formal architecture of Spanish court dress in early portraits, notably this full-length likeness by the Spanish court painter Alonso Sanchez Coello of Isabella at the age of about 20. A formidable presence in jewel-studded white satin, her gaze commands our attention today in the gallery of the Prado Museum, where it is surrounded by full-length portraits of authoritative Habsburg women. Today, we shall rather quickly survey Isabella's remarkable life and the place of the Eucharist series within it, and on the way, overturn any preconceptions the calm countenance in Rubens's portrait might suggest. Remarkably, there exists no comprehensive biography of Isabella of recent date. And so I must warn you, we will cover a lot of ground very quickly. Her considerable acumen as a patron of the arts was fundamentally shaped by her Habsburg upbringing and her own commitment to its traditions. However, the artistic achievements of the Golden Age, which resulted from her compassionate government, were the result of the presence of remarkable artists in the southern Netherlands and their own innovative practices, notably high-level collaboration among painters. In what follows, the necessary references to Counter-Reformation policy will be balanced, I promise, by forays into the pastimes and the furred and feathered companions that enriched Isabella's life and lightened the burden of leadership. Isabella was raised in the formative environment of the Spanish Habsburg court, where the affairs of the Netherlands and the central role, not just of art, but of Flemish artists, had a defining role in its culture. Isabella Clara Eugenia was the first child born to Philip II, King of Spain, and his third wife, the French princess Elizabeth of Valois. Her parents married in 1560. Philip, son of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, is portrayed here by his court painter Antonis Moore, who had attained fame as a portraitist in the Netherlands and moved to the Spanish court in 1559. His brilliant, polished style captured the dignity and refinement of young Philip, shown here carrying the baton of command and wearing a magnificent suit of armor with allegorical designs referring to his absolute authority. Moore's relationship with Philip offers a cautionary tale for any court painter. During a friendly exchange with the king in 1561, Moore impertinently touched the king on the shoulder with his maul stick. This shocking breach of etiquette sent Moore packing to the Netherlands immediately. In his spectacular portrait of Elizabeth Valois, known through versions after the original, the young bride is dressed in the color of love, a sumptuous pink. Moore reveled in the slashed openings of her gown, which exposed the intricate surfaces of the sleeves, and in the richness of her jewelry. And because they're the Habsburgs, we have baby portraits. So, perhaps not surprisingly for such a visually informed court, two delicate and touching portraits were made of Isabella and her younger sister, Caterina Michaela, who was born in 1568. Isabella appears in the painting on the left in her own version of a splendid pink gown, dressed as an adult. In the later double portrait on the right, Isabella stands on the right, slightly closer to the viewer, appropriately for her position as the elder sister. By this time, their mother, Elizabeth, had died, and Philip had married again, this time to his niece, Anna of Austria. News traveled in all directions from the Spanish court, but particularly to the Netherlands and France. Isabella was described by the French ambassador, even as a young child, as beautiful and intelligent. She received a rigorous education and spent some years in Madrid in the care of the convent of the Descalced Carmelites, where she established a special routine of devotional practice. To escape the restrictions of the court in Madrid, and frankly to micromanage state affairs, her father, the king, had traveled extensively throughout the realm. He spent time with his family in various palaces, including the new, remarkable granite palace and monastery of El Escorial, and together they all enjoyed fishing and hunting, pageants, and other entertainments. One of the most troublesome regions of Philip's dominions, but one which seems not to have received the king's full attention, was the religious uprising and then rebellion in the northern provinces of the Netherlands. Isabella's own life was to be inexorably tied to the fate of the Low Countries. Her birth on August 12, 1566, corresponds exactly to the outbursts of iconoclastic violence that spread across the region. Spurred in part by Protestant outdoor preachers, angry mobs spread waves of violence against Spanish authority, particularly as it was represented by the Catholic Church, and resulted in damage and destruction to church interiors and their decorations. The brutality of the Duke of Alva, dispatched by Philip to bring the rebellious population in line, and Spain's negligence in supporting its troops, had disastrous consequences and led to the organization of anti-Catholic forces in North Holland. The expert tactician Alessandro Farnese, who had been raised in the Spanish court, was sent as the new Spanish regent. His military campaign recaptured the major cities of the south, including the commercial center of Antwerp in 1585, after a long damaging siege. Isabella emerges from early accounts of her life as Philip II's favorite daughter and remained with him until his death. In Sanchez Coello's full-length portrait, she ostentatiously holds a cameo of her father, demonstrating that her position and authority derive from him. Her left hand rests on an eccentric and adored servant to the royal family, the dwarf Madalena Ruiz. Madalena holds two monkeys, which were fashionable for ladies at court. One is a golden lion tamarin from the rainforests of Brazil, and the other is a cottonhead tamarin from Colombia. Since Isabella assisted her father with state affairs by translating documents for him, she could well have had an intimate perspective on the rebellion and subsequent decisions to reestablish the Catholic faith and obedience to Spain. Her perspective on the Netherlands and its people might also have been favorably shaped by the vivid account of her father's tour in 1548-49 of the Habsburg territories written by Juan Calvat d'Estrella. And those volumes provided a lively description of the numerous festivities which entertained Philip in the Netherlands. One of the peculiar aspects of Philip's handling of the religious uprising in the Low Countries was his aggressive acquisition of the most famous religious paintings from its churches for his use in his own chapels and in Spain, and galleries in Spain. He succeeded in obtaining Rogier van der Weyden's Descent from the Cross, after admiring it in his Aunt Mary of Hungary's castle in Basch. She had obtained it a few years earlier from the Leuven Guild of Crossbowmen. And Philip had his Flemish court painter in Brussels, Michiel, copy it. Where the owners could not be persuaded to part with the painting, as in the case of the church warden of Ghent against St. Bavo Cathedral, and they refused under duress to sell their Ghent altarpiece, because then, as now, it was one of the reasons you go to Ghent, brought revenue to the church. The king simply ordered a copy, a task that took his painter, Michiel Coxey, 2 years. Isabella might have heard the tales of the shipwreck that dropped the Descent from the Cross into the sea in 1557 or 58. Happily, it was obviously safely retrieved. It was well packed. And she was about 8 years old when it was moved from the oratory at El Pardo to the Escorial in 1574. Philip's collection included several works by Hieronymus Bosch, and in one of the numerous letters to his daughters written in 1582, he tells them he has seen a Corpus Christi procession in Lisbon with devils in it, like those of Bosch. Philip's affection for Isabella placed no hindrance on his plans for her in his ever-changing political strategies. She was betrothed several times. Her father sought to place her on the French throne and later marry her cousin, Archduke Ernst, who governed the southern Netherlands, until his death in 1595. In 1598, Philip concluded the Treaty of Cession with France and gave the territories of the southern Netherlands and the Franche-Comté to Isabella as her dowry. In 1599, she married Albert of Austria, another cousin. Philip had appointed him Governor-General of the Spanish Netherlands the previous year, which the pair would rule jointly. Albert, who was about 39 years old at the time of his marriage, had been raised at the Madrid court. An intelligent man of few words, he had been cardinal and later bishop of Toledo and achieved a number of important diplomatic and military victories on behalf of Spain as Viceroy of Portugal. In fact, the couple had to abide by Spain's directives. Secret clauses accounted for every contingency, and if Albert and Isabella failed to produce an heir, the territories would return to the direct control of Spain. The archducal couple enjoyed certain privileges in the arrangement, which allowed them to print money and receive and send ambassadors. Ultimately, Isabella suffered 3 miscarriages, and no heir was produced from their marriage. By the late 1590s, large cities, notably Antwerp, had slowly begun to recover from the ravages of war. Farnese's victory and capture of the largest city and commercial hub in August 1585 was marked by terms that fundamentally changed its character. All non-Catholics were given 4 years in which to convert or depart. More than half the population relocated for religious and economic reasons, with many to the growing cities in the north, such as Amsterdam and Haarlem, with profound consequences for the development of art in the 17th century. Far from being a diplomatic formality, the ceremonial arrival of the archdukes in southern Netherlands was an important moment of exchange between the governors and the populace. And this is probably the only time I get to show you a stuffed horse in the audience, so pardon me, but I'm going to do it. So on the right you see the brown mare that Isabella rode in the Brussels entry. It is preserved in the royal collections in Brussels using somewhat surprising taxidermy techniques, which accounts for its rather odd proportions. The opportunity to greet the archdukes was keenly anticipated, as Antwerp and other cities sought assurances that peace would come to the realm, and with it desperately needed economic recovery. Triumphal entries had a long history in the Netherlands, and lavish sums were spent on outdoor decorations and festivities that, through allegory and rhetoric, presented often pointed commentaries on the qualities of the ruler and ambitious objectives for their rule. These so-called joyous entries, Lede-inkomsten, were contracts between the ruler and the city, confirming the rights and privileges that a city might continue to enjoy. As Albert and Isabella informed the members of their parliament, the States General, they believed their power was absolute and accountable to God alone. However, on street level, the entries, for which the programs had been devised by scholars and leading painters, they presented the archdukes in a variety of flattering guises, honoring their role as peacemakers. These sometimes fanciful allegories expressed a serious entreaty for a sensitive approach to political and economic challenges by the new governors. Nearly every city feted the couple's marriage as an omen of peace. The subjects of theatrical stages and decorative temporary architecture celebrated Albert for his military prowess and compared him with Hercules. Isabella was often cast as Pegasus or Aurora, restorative entities that would quell the militaristic urges of her husband and bring peace to the country. During their visit, the Antwerp city government also presented the couple with a set, and I'm showing you here one, set of 7 magnificent tapestries celebrating the battles of Archduke Albert, an ambitious program of secular propaganda that anticipates the Eucharist series in scope and magnificence. Despite the serious political import of these occasions, they were very festive, and the archdukes enjoyed the celebrations in their honor. Isabella, it was noted by an observer in Brussels, possessed that mark of civil femininity, that ideal hallmark for a cultivated woman of authority, the pleasant, smiling countenance. As highly theatrical and complex public events, there were unexpected surprises during triumphal entries, which enabled the sovereigns to laugh and react more naturally. Whether it was a mock fight by 60 stilt walkers in which performers fell over each other and into the audience, as in Namur, or an outdoor fountain in the jolly form of Bacchus, god of wine, which vigorously spurted wine in an arc that narrowly missed the festive canopy sheltering the archdukes. Isabella's letters contain many admissions that she had, quote-unquote, burst out laughing. The early years of their reign, though, presented the couple with many challenges. Skirmishes and battles with northern forces were increasingly embarrassing for southern forces. Were it not for the heroic action, for example, of his dapple-gray charger that took a musket shot intended for the Archduke in the neck, Albert would have lost his life in the Battle of Newport in Ostend in 1600. This type of steed was thereafter associated with Albert and appears in later works by court painters Rubens and Jan Bruegel the Elder. Isabella and Albert's strategy for defining their reign in a period of uncertainty relied on time-honored tactics employed by earlier Habsburg rulers. They emphasized the hereditary ties to Burgundian princes and to the quote-unquote happier times, the Goede of the late 15th and early 16th centuries, particularly the reign of Charles V, when the region was wealthy and stable. The Archduke's court in Brussels, atop the Koudenberg Hill, was characterized by piety and correctness, but also by a new decorum of splendid cultural display. The palace seen here, and much of its marvelous collection, was largely destroyed by huge fire in 1731. Albert and Isabella had inherited a portion of Archduke Ernst's collection of art, including an impressive group of Netherlandish paintings by Jan van Eyck, Rogier van der Weyden, and the series of Months by Peter Bruegel the Elder. They also acquired important paintings by earlier masters for their private apartments. In fact, Isabella followed her father's practice of acquiring important early altarpieces from the Netherlands for her own use. After visiting the church of the Benedictine Abbey at Gerardsbergen west of Brussels in August 1600, they were so impressed by the magnificent Adoration of the Magi by Jan Gossart on the high altar that they acquired it the following year from the abbot and transferred it to Brussels in 1603 to decorate the high altar of the palace chapel. In addition to its extraordinary beauty and Merriam theme, the painting's association with the brilliant court of Philip of Burgundy in the early 16th century would certainly have been meaningful to the archdukes, as both the painter Gossart and its original patron, the Lord of Bullar, had served Philip. As protégés of the Spanish court, Albert and Isabella confidently embarked on the time-honored use of portraiture and building strategies to articulate their enlightened and beneficent rule. Rather than import painters from Spain, however, they identified and supported outstanding painters with different specialties who were native to the region and placed them in a tiered system of court service. Initially, they employed famous established artists, and this magnificent portrait, with its lush differentiation of sumptuous fabrics, is probably by Franz Purbus the Younger. It shows the Archduchess in about 1599, after she had arrived in the southern Netherlands. While its format and the attributes of power, such as the chair, the young dwarf, and splendid drapery, epitomize the height of Spanish portrait fashion, Isabella's gentle gesture and softened countenance reflect a Netherlander sensibility. As befits her status, she is shown full length, dressed in a white silk gown lined with white fur, ornamented with pearls, and richly embroidered with joined rings, fleur-de-lis, purple and yellow pansies, and pink anemones in reference to her lineage. Her auburn hair is fashionably drawn back to accentuate her oval face. Her hair is decorated with a red cap studded with many large jewels in gold settings and pearls. Notably, she's wearing the large cross, or Borstkreuz, comprised of 6 substantial table-cut diamonds and 3 pearls, a reference that obviously its form evokes the Trinity. Evidently a piece of jewelry of great personal significance, Isabella was portrayed wearing it in every portrait up to the time she adopted the habit of the Poor Clares. Isabella and Albert were also proactive in their patronage. Through their agents, they kept a close eye on young, promising Flemish artists, even those working in Rome. Wenzel Kubecker, a painter with scientific and engineering interests and expertise, who had found fame in Rome, was secured on his return to Antwerp. He collaborated with Albert to build the commanding basilica dedicated to the Virgin on the hilltop in Scherpenheuvel in 1607, which became a lively site of pilgrimage under the archdukes. The other young artist in whom they took particular interest was, of course, Peter Paul Rubens. He had left Antwerp for the court in Mantua on May 9, 1600, already an important independent master. Once in Rome, in July 1601, the archducal agent, who was a friend of Rubens's older brother Philip, reported on his activities. Instead of an Italian painter, Albert engaged the young Fleming to paint 3 striking panels in 1602 to decorate the chapel of St. Helena as a gift to his former titular church, Santa Croce in Jerusalem. Rubens had been in Antwerp only a few months when, in early 1609, Albert and Isabella invited him to become their court painter. In a letter to a friend, Rubens acknowledged their generous terms and his own reservations. Quote, "I have not yet made up my mind whether to remain in my own country or to return forever to Rome, where I am invited on most favorable terms. Here also they do not fail to make every effort to keep me by every sort of compliment. The Archduke and most serene Infanta have had letters written urging me to remain in their service. Their offers are very generous, but I have little desire to become a courtier again. Antwerp and its citizens would satisfy me if I could say farewell to Rome." End quote. In fact, Rubens was persuaded to remain among his family and friends, and the terms of his appointment as a court painter were exceptional among the artists serving the archdukes. In addition to an annual pension of 500 florins, which I think, and my colleagues can assist me, is about a quarter of the cost of a large altarpiece he would have painted. That was his yearly pension. He could live in Antwerp rather than at the Brussels court, and he was exempt from the regulations and fees of the local painters' guild. The archdukes, in fact, were to pay him for paintings over and above his pension. And as a show of their high regard, the appointment was accompanied with exceptional gifts, a sword and a gold chain with a medal bearing the portraits of the archdukes. Rubens was a devout Catholic of unassailable integrity. In the numerous altarpieces he painted for guilds and others after 1609, he gave visual form to the deeply felt portrayals of episodes from the Passion of Christ and the suffering of saints. Drawing on antique sculptural sources and recent Italian developments, he produced compositions that achieved the requisite legibility and iconographic clarity in keeping with the Council of Trent ideals for religious imagery, but also transmitted deeper emotional truths. Antwerp was still the largest and most important city in the region, and it was the beneficiary of the Archduke's commitment to bolstering its religious institutions, particularly the Cathedral of Our Lady. Following the 1611 promulgation by the Archdukes to fund the repair and refurbishment of churches damaged during the war, the transept and vaulting of the central aisle of the enormous Gothic cathedral were finally completed. Isabella and Albert's considerable involvement in the cathedral was marked with a splendid stained glass window. Trust me, it's much more splendid than this slide. Refurbishment in the area of orthodoxy was a competitive process. In 1612-14, for example, Rubens painted the monumental triptych of the Descent from the Cross for the Colviniers Guild, one of the 6 armed or militia guilds of the city, whose membership comprised elite figures, including its mayor, who was a friend of Rubens. It stood on the altar in the transept, and in the contract, Rubens was charged with meeting or exceeding the altarpieces nearby. Compositions such as the Eucharist, such as the Entombment, transmitted heroic and muscular ideals beyond the Netherlands. This work, in which the wound in the side of Christ is situated at the precise center of the composition, is painted on canvas, perhaps for easier transportation. It may have been intended for a Spanish patron, as it had already entered an important Madrid collection by 1651. This enormous, and it's about 7 feet by 8 feet, Madonna and Child in a Flower Garland by Rubens and Jan Bruegel the Elder, is a spectacular version of the type developed by Bruegel after an altarpiece by Rubens in Rome. While celebrating the popular cult of devotion to the Virgin Mary, a central part of Catholic revival under the Archdukes, the garland is also one of the most magnificent examples of the collaborative friendship between Rubens and Bruegel. The Archdukes commissioned paintings to be given as gifts to religious houses, including the Assumption of the Virgin for the Descalced Carmelites in Brussels. The early altarpiece for Albert that Rubens had painted in Rome, and court-related commissions after 1609 led to a relaxed and reasonably close relationship between the Archduke and Rubens, who named his eldest son after his patron. The affinities between Rubens, and also, to a lesser extent, Jan Bruegel the Elder, and their patrons, led to the development of new subjects that linked the public and private devotion with public politics and Habsburg history. In the Vision of St. Hubert, a collaborative work in which Bruegel painted the landscape and animals and Rubens the figure of the saint, a young nobleman who chose to hunt on a feast day is confronted with the crucifix as it appeared between the antlers of the stag he had pursued through the woods, leading to his sudden conversion. The archdukes were especially devoted to the cult of this local saint, who was famous for proselytizing in remote areas and whose shrine stood in the forest outside Brussels. One of the reasons Rubens decided to remain in Antwerp was the imminent advent of peace in the region. A decade after their arrival, the archdukes achieved what had been implored of them, the signing of the peace treaty between Spain and the provinces of the nascent Dutch Republic in 1609. Although short-lived, the hostilities resumed again in 1621. It produced a brief burgeoning of hope and economic vigor. The elite artistic collaboration between the two court painters, Rubens and Bruegel, one the undisputed master of large-scale figure subjects, and the other a renowned specialist of finely detailed still life and landscapes, epitomize the harmonious relationship of the joint sovereigns they served. Rubens and Bruegel's collaboration was extraordinary due to the conceptual nature of their partnership and the rarity of their joint works. Jan Bruegel the Elder's refined landscapes, allegories, and highly detailed still lifes were among the artistic wonders of the period. Son of Peter Bruegel the Elder, he had held the position of painter to their Royal Highnesses by 1608, a designation he shared with other artists. In fact, he had already received special dispensation from the archdukes in 1606, who had provided license to him to transport his paintings. The terms of his service to the court unusually allowed Bruegel to remain in Antwerp, and he was exempt from taxes and from serving the civic guard. Spurred perhaps by the extraordinary generosity shown Rubens, Bruegel, who was actually the elder of the two painters, more senior, sought in 1610 to convince the archdukes to improve his own service terms. But they noted that he was only occasionally, in their words, he's only occasionally occupied with work in their service. In The Return from War, Venus, goddess of love, disarms Mars, the god of war, in a vaulted underground passage of Vulcan's smithy. This allegory of peace, painted at the time of the 12-year truce, ending hostilities between Spain and the rebel provinces, is one of the largest collaborations by Rubens and Bruegel. The theme recalls the triumphal entries of 1599, in which the archdukes were praised as restorers of peace and unity. With Albert cast in military guise, and the love of their union expected to banish violence. War and armaments were also associated with the sense of touch, brilliantly articulated by the embrace of the new goddess by Mars. The guinea pigs in the foreground are the exotic embodiments of fruitfulness that accompany peace. A particularly notable example of collaboration is Rubens's large-scale figure and flower painting, Phasias and Glycera, painted with Ossius Barrett, of course here at the Ringling, you know it well, in which Barrett's lyrically painted still life maintains a complementary presence that balances the robust figures. The new security felt by the archdukes in the second decade may have spurred their desire for updated official likenesses. Rubens's original compositions are lost, but these versions are among the best sent as gifts that transmitted the likenesses of Albert and Isabella throughout their realm. The traditions of Spanish portraiture, such as the rich red velvet background and use of table and chair as attributes of authority, remain. So I'll give you Isabella, actually. Though formal, there is a relaxed directness about both portraits, particularly Isabella's. She's resplendent in a black gown, richly decorated with gold embroidered bands, and wears a large and delicate lace wheel ruff and cuffs. The diamond cross is a familiar feature, but the jewels in her hair of earlier portraits have been replaced by gentle silk flowers. The beautiful engraved portrait of Isabella in view in the exhibition follows the treatment of features and hair of a slightly later portrait type. A laurel wreath and hanging bunches of flowers of honor surround her countenance, just as garlands surround a revered central image. The archdukes very much wished to be associated with their territory, the countryside. They bore affection for the region and its people, but they recognized the importance of linking Spain through them to its possessions. The long history of landscape painting in the Netherlands, and we must remember that there really was no tradition of landscape painting in Spain, although 16th century Flemish landscapes were avidly collected at court. Landscape played an important role in conveying the personal associations of the archdukes with the country. These pendants may have promoted the Netherlandish specialties of landscape and portraiture to a Spanish court audience. Behind the sitters are meticulously executed views of two palaces, Tervuren, which was the palace long enjoyed by the Dukes of Burgundy and Charles V as a summer retreat and hunting base, which was behind Albert, and this distinctive square form of Merriam, the favorite palace of Albert and Isabella behind the Archduchess. Juxtaposed with the portraits, they suggest the wider aristocratic associations with leisurely pursuits. A few years earlier, in 1612-13, Bruegel had depicted the archdukes as the honored guests, and you can see them there to the right, it's the bride's left, but you see them in the image on our right, at a peasant wedding. The presence of Isabella and Albert with their canine companion, which I hope you can see, there's a dog sitting between them, surrounded by members of their court, promoted their efforts to be perceived as sympathetic rulers tied to the rhythms of their country. Other images attest to Isabella's special relationship with her subjects. One of the most important events of her reign immediately attained almost mythic stature. On May 31st, 1615, Isabella participated in the Senior Guild of Crossbowmen's of Brussels shooting contest, held in part to celebrate a miraculous image of the Virgin. Isabella took the prize by shooting the bird-shaped target atop the spire of the Church of Our Lady of the Sablon with her crossbow. She was awarded the title of Queen. Normally you were called the King of the Guild, but she couldn't obviously be that, and received a magnificent collar and gold jewel in the shape of a bird. For the elite members of these armed guilds in Brussels and around the country, many of whom counted the participation in shooting contests by visiting princes, particularly Charles V in the 16th century. He was Isabella's grandfather. These were among the most prestigious aspects of their history, so this event was of great significance. With one shot, Isabella won the allegiance of an influential sector of society. In Van Veen's double portrait here, the Guild's bird-shaped jewel is significantly juxtaposed with the considerably more prestigious knightly order of the Golden Fleece worn by Albert. And you may also be able to see that Isabella wears a smaller ornament of the popinjay with crossbows in her hair. Just as the archdukes imposed structure on religious and state affairs, they also controlled access to more fun things like hunting, which were princely prerogatives. To reduce poaching and other incursions, restrictions on hunting could only be enjoyed by the archdukes and the aristocracy. Thus, the early characterization in 1599 of Isabella as Diana was perhaps one of the least risible allegories. She was an excellent horsewoman and a very keen hunter, and she and Albert had expanded the park around the Brussels court and stocked it with deer. Together, Rubens and Bruegel created smaller cabinet-sized mythological landscapes. Bruegel took the lead in these productions, with many of the animals in his paintings drawn from life. The goddess of the hunt's hounds are based on life sketches of Isabella's own companions. She was attended much of the time, it seems, by numerous dogs of different varieties. The veritable canine flotilla was celebrated in this large painting, which is 6 feet by 8 feet, with Doña Juana, lady-in-waiting to Isabella. Each dog is labeled with its name in Spanish, and I can tell you that the small dog on the left is called Cadet, for those of you who can close and see it in the front. Interest in the natural world, particularly animals and birds from the New World colonies, were a distinguishing feature of the archducal court. In addition to her many dogs, the corridors of Isabella's palaces were alive with the scampering of monkeys of various sorts, squawking macaws and parrots. From a young age, Isabella had been encouraged to acquire knowledge of the natural world, and her enthusiasm was shared by collectors. After 1600, she and Albert added aviaries and special enclosures for hawks, eagles, parakeets, and rare pheasants in the park around the Brussels Palace. Bruegel enjoyed access to the royal gardens and menagerie and could see some of the larger exotic animals such as dromedaries in processions. Perhaps the ubiquitous pair of black and white guinea pigs, see if you can spot them here, which were originally, of course, from South America, which appear in so many of Bruegel's works. Perhaps these animals were gifts from the Archduchess to the artist. The marvelous array of creatures which arrived at court as gifts to Isabella from her family are among the captivating subjects Bruegel included in the so-called paradise landscapes created during peacetime in the 16 teens. Painted encyclopedias of the natural kingdom, they celebrate the beauty and diversity of God's creations. His close friendship with Rubens enabled him to borrow, quote-unquote, the figures of certain animals that Rubens had painted or drawn to include in his novel form of landscape. And in this piece we see the gray stallion again, the lions, and also a pair of frolicking leopards. So I'm going to show you a series of slides in sequence here, so pardon the speed, but so the allegory of sight, of hearing, of touch, of smell, and taste. Bruegel's encyclopedic inventions reflect the rich abundance of the court's collections of paintings, sculpture, tapestries, armor, and musical instruments. Female personifications of the senses occupy princely chambers that reflect the wealth and splendor of the Archduke's court, with their castles depicted in the distance. While it has often been assumed that the series was commissioned by Albert and Isabella, due to incomplete inventories for the archducal collections, it is impossible to determine whether the works, these were works that they possessed, and whether sight, for example, is a visual catalogue. Bruegel's paintings seem to represent an informed fantasy that evokes the riches and diversity of the archducal holdings of paintings without precisely documenting them. In sight, the double portrait of the archdukes resembles a version that is, in sight, and I will not point, but in the center on the table you'll see a double portrait of the archdukes, which resembles a version that we know from copies, but it's not a specific example that survives today. The equestrian portrait is also lost, but is known from surviving versions. And we also see on the far right one of Bruegel's own paintings, The Virgin and Child in a Garland. While Rubens provided the figures, the concept and most of the execution was Bruegel's. Even if they are idealized views of princely collecting, the allegories of the senses nonetheless present the archducal court in Brussels as magnificent locus of supreme taste and magnificent. The series of the five senses, 1617 to 18, established an influential precedent for the idealized views of collections within an interior, such as the gallery of the ambitious amateur of the arts, Cornelis van der Geest. Painted in 1628, the scene, which is again not a specific record of a particular room, recalls a visit by the archdukes to van der Geest's Antwerp collection in August 1615. Isabella, whom you see in the lower left, holds a small floral still life on her lap, while Rubens offers insight to Albert about the Virgin and Child by Quentin Metzeis that's presented by van der Geest. And those of you, I'm sure, very familiar with the Ringling's collection, there is a Quentin Metzeis painting very similar to this here. In 1621, Albert passed away only a few months after the Spanish king, Philip III's death. The 12 years' truce, signed in 1609 with the United Provinces of the North, had also crumbled. Isabella was appointed governess general by her nephew Philip IV and assumed a more visible role, pursuing policies with Rubens serving in a diplomatic capacity. Initially, he operated covertly, but became increasingly visible as his artistic vocation gave him a passport to all the courts. Philip IV, who had expressed derision at Isabella's appointment of a painter as a diplomatic agent, acknowledged Rubens' devotion to Isabella by appointing him a peer of the realm in 1624. In recognition of his diplomatic talents, the king assigned to him to implement the successful peace negotiations with England. Like her grandfather, Charles V, and great-aunt before her, Isabella had to modify her plans for retirement to monastic seclusion, and instead she marked her profound attachment to the descalzos with the tapestries that are the subject of many of the presentations today. the health of the workshops in Brussels, which were still able to produce extraordinary sets of tapestries of a quality commensurate with those produced for Habsburg rulers in the previous century, reflected her concerted efforts over the last 2 decades to bolster the tapestry industry with favorable legislation and commissions. The scope of Isabella's ambitions at the end of her reign is clear from the scale and complexity of the program. This sacred undertaking was paralleled in the political sphere by an enormous engineering project, the building of the Fossa Eugeniana, or the Spanish Rhine-Maas Canal, that Isabella was overseeing simultaneously. It was a fortified canal, almost 40 miles long, and it was intended to divert trade around the defenses of the United Provinces. As the last commission from the Archduchess, Rubens painted the great Saint Ildefonso altarpiece, a gift to the chapel of the Brotherhood of Saint Ildefonso in Brussels in memory of Albert. For the Archduchess, Rubens retained the traditional triptych format, albeit on a commanding scale, which permitted the couple to be reunited in the interior wings in conventional poses, kneeling at prie-dieus attended by their patron saints. With its rich palette and vibrant brushwork, Rubens captured the splendor of Isabella's court and the unshakable faith that defined it for the last time. Isabella died on December 1st, 1633, having evaded a feeble assassination attempt with aplomb. Thank you.
Well, our next presenter, Susan Merriam, is Assistant Professor of Art History at Bard College, a contributor to a number of scholarly journals and anthologies. She is also the author of the book Still Life and Devotion in the 17th Century Flemish Garland Paintings, and is currently working on Being Animal, Becoming Human, exploring the human-animal boundary in the visual culture of early modern Europe.
I'd like to say thank you to everyone who's put this project together as well, but in particular Virginia, who was kind enough to invite me. I just want to make sure I know how to forward these. Okay, I see. Okay. Thank you. Rubens' erudition, his training in classical and theological subjects, and his fertile imagination have provided us with rich, complex images in the medium of tapestry. Here, I'm showing one of the 3 triumphs in the series, representing the triumph of divine love. Caritas rides in a small processional chariot drawn by 2 lions surrounded by motifs of sacred and profane love. Often, Rubens's complex allusions and knowledge of historical sources engage scholars and fans in a rich and satisfying interpretive process, wherein we are drawn deeply into his iconographic and compositional inventions. The Eucharist series has been the subject of several fantastically rigorous analyses of this sort. What I have planned today is something different. I come at Rubens' tapestries somewhat obliquely, one might say, having researched his collaborations with Jan Bruegel and representations of the Eucharist more generally. What I would like to do is take a somewhat broader view of the tapestries in this talk. Bringing them into a much wider context allows me to be attentive to a few understudied aspects of the works. In pursuit of this goal, I will examine the tapestries in 2 contexts. First, I'll look at Rubens' tapestry designs within the context of Counter-Reformation visual culture. I'll examine how the tapestry series can be contextualized within a group of images, all created after the Council of Trent, which Anne and Virginia both mentioned. that celebrate and defend the Eucharist in the wake of Protestant critiques. I'll briefly discuss the extent to which Rubens' series can be linked in relatively straightforward ways with other images created in his milieu, and then I'll turn to Rubens' overall conception of the series and his use of trompe-l'oeil, suggesting that these aspects of the work can bear more consideration. In the second part of the talk, I'm going to take another broad view, so two separate broad views of the works, by examining the Eucharist tapestries as they relate to their Habsburg context. Historically, the Habsburgs celebrated their origins in a story first recorded in 1340, illustrated in this picture by Rubens and Jan Wildens, that links the elevation of Rudolf I to Holy Roman Emperor in 1273 to his encounter with a priest carrying the Eucharist to a dying man. The story recounts how Rudolf helped the priest navigate an impassable river in order to perform the sacrament, and tells how the priest in turn predicted that Rudolf would one day rule the world. Ruben shows a close-up of the priest carrying the monstrance, Rudolph's horse, as well as the future emperor himself. We're seeing lots of horses today, I guess. The church in the background reminds the viewer of the larger significance of the story. In the second half of the talk, I consider how Rubens' program may have had special resonance for the Habsburgs within this self-valorizing context, as well as how the tapestries relate to other Habsburg Eucharist images and rituals. Few religious rituals are as complex as the reenactment of Christ's sacrifice on the cross each time the Mass is performed. In this moment, the highlight of the Catholic Mass, the host is raised above the altar by the priest, who says the words, "This is my body." According to Catholic doctrine, the white disc becomes Christ's actual body at the priest's utterance without changing its form in any way. The mystery of this extraordinary change, transubstantiation, vexed both adherents and critics of the practice, who often found it difficult to understand how the host could change in substance, but fail to be altered in appearance. The process is ultimately described as miraculous. As it is divinely accomplished, transubstantiation does not adhere to earthly laws and cannot be explained by worldly things such as chemistry or physics. Throughout the centuries preceding Rubens' execution of the tapestry models, this moment had been celebrated by holding the host in front of an image, a sculpture or painting, representing a related subject. Roger van der Weyden's altarpiece of the Seven Sacraments, shown here, executed in the mid-15th century, is both a document of the practice and an extraordinary image celebrating the Church's defining moments. The priest stands in the furthest point of the nave with his back turned toward us and elevates the host before a retable, a sculpted wooden altarpiece commonly used in the medieval to late medieval period before painted altarpieces became more common. Although the Mass could be performed in any of the Church's apses, van der Weyden highlights the importance of the ritual in terms of its sacramental value by aligning it with the central portion of the architecture of the Church itself. In other words, the Eucharist is the foundation of the Church. Van der Weyden also ingeniously uses the logic of perspective construction to insist on the significance of the ritual. The picture space is organized not simply around the architecture of the church, but around the vanishing point or the location in the recesses of the painting at roughly the point of the host, from which all the diagonals coming out and organizing the space of the painting emanate. Perhaps the most surprising aspect of the image to a contemporary audience is the crucifixion scene in the foreground. The scene is obviously, for us, out of time and place, but it references the fact that each time the Mass is performed, it marks Christ's sacrifice on the cross. Rubens' Eucharist tapestries employ a conceit equally as clever, some would say more clever, as van der Weyden's. Rubens represents a series of narratives about the Eucharist by depicting a trompe-l'oeil tapestry within a trompe-l'oeil architectural framework, all in the medium of tapestry. Here, of course, is one of the cartoons or models, so it's not an actual tapestry. Moses and the Discovery of Manna, for example, depicts the story from Exodus of the miraculous appearance of manna, a mysterious substance described as fine flakes, fine as hoarfrost, white like coriander seed, and having the taste of wafers made of honey. Manna, God's second miraculous feeding of the Israelites while they struggled through the Sinai desert, appeared to early Christian interpreters as a prefiguration of the Eucharist. And remember, Virginia had mentioned prefigurations earlier. The narrative is pictured on a trompe-l'oeil tapestry in the final version, held up by putti between trompe-l'oeil columns. Infusing the trompe-l'oeil tapestry with the actual tapestry on which it is pictured, Rubens alludes to the complexity of illusion and the representation of materiality, central issues in the conception of the Eucharist. During the period in which Rubens created his tapestries, the Catholic Church vigorously defended the doctrine of the real presence of the Eucharist, which had been critiqued throughout the 16th century by Protestant reformers, and Anne had alluded to that. Here, in the Triumph of the Church, Ecclesia rides in on a chariot, monstrance in hand. The Council of Trent's statement on transubstantiation made clear that when the priest said the words, "This is my body," the bread of the Mass transformed into the body of Christ, while the wine transformed into the blood. But virtually all of the most important Protestant thinkers had something negative to say about the Catholic doctrine of the Eucharist. Luther came close to Catholic doctrine, arguing for what he termed sacramental union. In the sacramental union, the consecrated bread of the Eucharist is united with the body of Christ, and the consecrated wine of the Eucharist is united with the blood of Christ by virtue of Christ's original institution. The result? Anyone eating and drinking these elements, the consecrated bread and wine, eat and drink the physical body and blood of Christ as well. Calvin was much more extreme, arguing that Christ was present in the Mass itself, but not in the bread and wine. Zwingli, the leader of the Reformation in Switzerland, was the most extreme in rejecting transubstantiation entirely. He argued that the Mass was not a sacrifice in the same way that the crucifixion was. Therefore, the Mass can only be a figure of Christ's sacrifice, a representation. In the face of this criticism, in 1563 at the Council of Trent, the Church affirmed the doctrine of the real presence in very powerful language. This affirmation of the real presence and an emphasis on the display of the Eucharist, particularly in public, are elements that define the militancy of the Catholic Church in the wake of these Protestant critiques. Rubens's tapestries were commissioned in this context, and they are representative of its most fundamental mission during this time. In the period after the Council of Trent, the Church placed a great deal of emphasis on images that affirmed the Eucharist's doctrinal significance. This interest in confirming the Eucharist's truth should not be surprising, given the amount of criticism to which it had been subjected in the preceding period. Also not surprising, given the subject, is that these images tend to be relatively straightforward, some would say dry, showing the church fathers posed around an altar on which a host sits in a monstrance or in a tabernacle. The array of figures across the foreground in this type of image, often in a frieze-like composition, tend to produce somewhat static images, providing more of a didactic than an emotional function. In this work by Abraham Bloemaert, 4 ecclesiastics discuss the Eucharist while putti hover above and heaven bursts open. St. Augustine on the left, in episcopal robes, explores the dogma of transubstantiation, pointing at the Eucharist and turning toward the beholder. The half-nude ascetic St. Jerome makes a point to his interlocutor. Bishop Ambrose looks at writings about the dogma by Pope Gregory, who looks towards the Eucharist. Saints were also used to support the sacrament of the Eucharist, particularly saints who had played a specific role in its protection. In Rubens' hometown, that's Antwerp, that saint was Norbert, who was famed for quelling a heresy propagated by Tanchelm, an early 12th century heretic who claimed that the Eucharist did not aid in salvation. Tanchelm had attracted a large following in Antwerp and threatened the church's hegemony in preaching about its central doctrine. In response, Norbert led a small band of followers into the city, took over the Church of St. Michael, and reestablished the orthodoxy of the Eucharist. Norbert's victory is celebrated in this image by Cornelis de Vos, which shows St. Norbert receiving the holy vessels from the Antwerp citizens. And St. Norbert will appear again in this talk. In addition to images, the church invested in liturgical furnishings, monstrances, chalices, and altar cloths. Monstrances, and here I'm showing you two from the Ringling collection. I don't know if these are the ones that are out on display. Monstrances, elaborately constructed containers in which the Eucharist was held up during the Mass, were central to the display of the host. Over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries, monstrances changed in style from roughly modeling something like a church architecture offering an enclosure for the host, to more elaborate framing systems designed to look like sunbursts. These are the earlier form. As a series comprised of different types of narratives framed within a complex pictorial conceit, Rubens' tapestries are much more complex and multi-layered than most other works depicting Eucharistic subjects during this period. That said, many of Rubens' narratives can be linked to other works, precedents or works produced around the same time. This image, Abraham and Melchizedek, is one of the four so-called prefigurations, and it depicts an encounter between Abraham and Melchizedek after Abraham had been victorious in battle. Abraham offers to give Melchizedek some of the spoils of the battle. In return, Melchizedek gives Abraham bread and wine for his men. During the Counter-Reformation, the medieval custom of using Old Testament prefigurations of the New Testament was being revived. And again, this is something Virginia mentioned earlier this morning. In particular, subjects such as the sacrament, which had been critiqued by Protestants, were validated by their association with Old Testament prototypes. 3 of the prefiguration scenes that Rubens depicts in the Eucharist series can be found this is just one example of an earlier instance in this altarpiece by Dirk Bouts, which is an Last Supper altarpiece. And these are the Abraham and Melchizedek, Moses discovering the manna, and the Elijah and the angel. One of the prefigurations that Rubens has used is more complicated in relationship to precedents. It's not depicted here. This is to give you a sense of the way Rubens transforms some earlier images into his own. There are 2 victory panels, and these depend less on traditional iconographic sources and more on Rubens's fertile imagination, as one author calls it. These and the overall conception of the series are some of Rubens's most inventive contributions to the subject of the Eucharist. This is the victory over pagan sacrifices, which depicts a traditional Roman sacrifice of a bull, which is interrupted by the Eucharist, coming in from the upper right-hand side. And in the background, you can also see 2 priests pouring libations on a fire in front of a statue of Jupiter, and that's on the left-hand side. I'm showing you a print here because I think there's a specific detail I wanted to mention which shows up more clearly in the print. The victory of Eucharistic truth over controversy shows the allegorical figures of truth and time. Time is the winged figure. Truth points to a scroll which says, "This is my body" in Latin, and thus alludes to the words said in the Mass. Luther is shown in the foreground in a monk's hood. That's the foreground on the right. And Calvin is behind him with his finger in a book, presumably defending his doctrines. Tanchelm the heretic lies holding a monstrance in the foreground. In what could be a reference to the iconoclasms and image critiques of the preceding century, and this is something Anne alluded to, you can see on the right-hand side a man with a hammer, and it's possible that he's attacking what is a sculpture of the Virgin and Child in the right-hand side. Scholars are not clear about whether this is absolutely the case. Images about iconoclasm are, of course, not uncommon during this period, but this element of the tapestry may have greater resonance, a point to which I will return. The series has 3 triumphs, which derive from antique and more recent sources, including a series by Rubens' teacher, Otto von Veen. Anne showed you a portrait by von Veen. Von Veen created a series of triumphs of the Catholic Church, which are not anywhere near as animated as Rubens's, let's just say. Rubens invests these scenes with an extraordinary sense of vitality and movement, and I think of all the Eucharist tapestries, these are probably this one in particular, are the most have been the most appealing to interpreters. The 4 evangelists, which I'm showing here, and the Eucharistic saints, which Anne showed and Virginia showed, could be figures intended to follow the processional chariots or announcers and defenders of the Eucharist. Luke with an ox is on the left. Mark holds his gospel and is accompanied by a lion, a sign of the resurrection. St. Matthew appears with his gospel and an angel, while St. John on the right looks at an eagle, the only creature that can look at the sun, and thus a sign of John's apocalyptic vision. Scribner, who's written a lot about this series, as Virginia also mentioned this morning, argues that one of the primary sources for this is probably Raphael's Disputa, and I'll just show it to you quickly, due to the fact that there is not only a early church fathers depicted here, but that they're attentive to the adoration of the monstrance. And then the last thing I wanted to show you of the series is the sketch which is in Chicago, which we've also seen already today. This is a sketch of the 5 tapestries that are called the altar group. On the lower portion on the left, you can see secular figures, among them Philip IV, Philip II, Philip IV's Queen Isabella, and then our Isabella, more in the background. On the right-hand side is the ecclesiastical, or a series of ecclesiastical figures paying tribute to the monstrance, and then on the upper portion, a celestial adoration. This type of image is quite common during the Counter-Reformation in terms of paying tribute to the Eucharist. Many scholars have commented on the ingenuity and inventiveness Rubens brings to these images of the Eucharist. Many scholars have also said that Rubens animates the Eucharist, brings a high level of visual interest and drama to what is, after all, a somewhat abstract subject. And I'll just go back. This is a good example. When this aspect of the works is discussed in the scholarship, it's often described as Baroque in the sense that the works have a kind of dynamism, which I think is obvious looking at this image. I'd like to push this point a bit and suggest that the series has an emotionalism, an engaging aspect that is absent from most images of the sacrament, even those that Rubens has used as models for inspiration. By emotionalism, I mean that the images have an affecting quality. The drama in many of the tapestries is such that the viewer becomes emotionally involved in the narrative. This emotional quality distinguishes Rubens' images from others produced on the subject. And I might just add, last night one of the things that Arthur Wheelock mentioned was that Mr. Ringling might not have been fully aware of the doctrinal and historical significance of the Eucharist depictions in the tapestries, but that he might have been attracted more to their spectacular and emotional aspects. So I thought that was interesting. It's important to note, however, that Rubens' images are not absent of the didactic, doctrinal, or historical material that would be found in other images produced about the same subject. Quite the opposite. I would extend the observation that in addition to engaging our emotions to an extent unusual with depictions of the Eucharist, Rubens makes us into readers and interpreters. By this I mean that because of the varied compositional forms and modes Rubens employs, so the prefigurations, the triumphs, and the victories, all of which are different types of image in the way they reference the world and in the types of precedents they draw from, the viewer is asked to re-engage each time he or she shifts to a new segment of the work. That is, by juxtaposing these modes, Rubens requires us to rethink each story or representation of the Eucharist from a different interpretive angle. This engagement distinguishes the series from other Counter-Reformation works, which tend to be much more straightforwardly didactic. So in other words, I think Rubens functions on multiple levels in the way he has us engaging in the works. A related issue, one having to do with the way the tapestries make us attentive to the act of looking, is linked to the fact that they're done in trompe-l'oeil. A surprising image in this context. Trompe-l'oeil was very rarely used in association with the Eucharist. More often it is found in still life painting, as in this image by Adriaan van der Speld and Frans van Mieris. Trompe-l'oeil employs traditional perspective techniques, but instead of developing a sense of three-dimensionality in depth receding from the picture plane, the perspective used in trompe-l'oeil creates the illusion that the forms depicted are emerging from the canvas into the viewer's space. Much trompe-l'oeil painting, such as this one, subsumes the painter's mark into the surface of the canvas. And just to be clear, this entire image is painted. There's no sometimes people think that the curtain is real. It's actually all painted. This aspect of trompe-l'oeil, the fact that it obscured the work of painting, enabled art critics such as Vasari to demean it, as it appeared to copy from rather than select and perfect nature. In the 17th century, trompe-l'oeil was discussed in terms of the delightful deceptions it provided viewers, and this image is a reference to a story from antiquity in which painters tricked each other with their clever representation of what appeared to be reality. It's perhaps because of these associations with duplicity, trompe-l'oeil was rarely used for devotional images. But trompe-l'oeil's deceptive qualities might work more positively in two ways within the context of the tapestries. One of the critiques some Protestant reformers leveled at images was that they were illusions, tricks, and lies. For Calvin, the only things that should be painted or sculpted were things that the eye was capable of seeing. Calvinists, in Stuart Clark's words, Clark's a writer who's written a great deal on vision in this period, argued that, quote, in attempting to act as visual copies, religious images created spurious, inappropriate, and dangerous forms of verisimilitude. In short, they lied, end quote. But trompe-l'oeil, the seemingly most deceptive type of image, never actually fooled anyone. In fact, the more the art in creating the illusion was concealed, the greater the viewer's attention to the way the work was made. Trompe-l'oeil, as Ruskin suggested many years later, drew attention to the viewer's relationship to the image, thus asking them to reflect on the nature of illusion. The nature of illusion is, of course, fundamentally important to the conception of the Eucharist. Due to Rubens's use of trompe-l'oeil, each level of representation in the tapestries speaks about a different type of visual reality, asking the viewer to contemplate one of the fundamental characteristics of the Eucharist, how it can look like one thing, yet be another. That is, the point of transubstantiation, the Eucharist changes into the body and blood of Christ, yet still looks like that white disk. The pictures thus cleverly allude to the notion of the real presence through the material of the representation itself. I think there's a lot more to be said about this issue of the use of trompe-l'oeil, and we can talk about that in the question period. So, for example, Rubens isn't painting, he's using the tapestries. But now I'd like to turn to my second context, the context of the Habsburgs. As I noted earlier, the Habsburgs trace the origins of the dynasty to a miracle involving the Eucharist. The Habsburgs replayed this origin myth over the following centuries in a number of ways, and I'm only showing you a tiny, tiny fraction of the types of engagement the Habsburgs had with the Eucharist during the 16th and 17th century. One early chronicler of the Viennese court recounted how, quote, Ferdinand II, the most Catholic emperor, today in the middle of the city of Vienna with the people looking on, leapt down from his carriage and made his way on foot in order that he could accompany the most sacred host, end quote. The chronicler goes on to describe how Ferdinand and the rest of the Habsburgs could not help but model themselves after Rudolf, otherwise they would be, quote, fall short of this model, end quote. So the Habsburgs continuously re-evoke or invoke this idea of Rudolf leaping down off his horse and offering the horse to the priests with the monstrance. The family also paid tribute to the Eucharist by attaching itself to one of the many miracles associated with hosts. One of the most publicized miracle stories in 17th century Flanders was the miracle of the hosts of St. Gudule. According to the legend, a group of thieves, and it's typical in many of these Eucharist stories, they're Jews. There's very strong strain of anti-Semitism running through many of these stories. A group of thieves stole a number of hosts from a parish church in order to profane them. The thieves pierced the hosts with knives, at which point the host began bleeding. In terror, the thieves desperately tried to rid themselves of the miraculous hosts. The person from whom they had sought help eventually turned them in, and they were subsequently burned at the stake. Later, the hosts were put in the care of the Brussels Collegiate Church and were worshipped as important relics. Archdukes Albert and Isabella, along with the rest of their incredible patronage that Anne reviewed, supported this devotion and gave elaborate gifts to the church in order to embellish the space in which the hosts were kept. The Habsburgs were also deeply involved in promoting the 40 Hours devotion. The 40 Hours devotion first emerged in Italy in 1520 and gradually became popular throughout Europe. And I'm showing you here what's called an apparato, which is a type of device for showing the host. And you can just see it, the tiny white host in the background in that sort of kind of tabernacle. The title of the 40 Hours devotion refers to several events, the most important of which is the last hours of Christ's life. The Habsburg court in Vienna was the center of elaborate theatrical productions of the 40 Hours devotion staged by the Jesuits. There, enormous theatrical sets were constructed and placed on the high altar in order to celebrate and draw attention to the sacrament of the Eucharist. At first, the sets were comprised of an arrangement of objects, including candles and elaborate candlesticks, elegant silver reliquaries, silver vases filled with lush bouquets, oil lamps, and precious hangings. During the first decade of the 17th century, these became more and more illusionistic, eventually developing into very complex settings that had a series of sort of stage sets working across the stage, behind which were placed oil lamps and candles such that there seemed to be this miraculous light cast on the Eucharist. This is yet another work commissioned by yet another Habsburg associated with the Eucharist. This is probably commissioned by Leopold Wilhelm from Jan Davids de Heem in 1648. It represents the transubstantiated host above a chalice in a niche surrounded by a garland of flowers and fruits, many of which reference the Eucharist. Originally, the painting had a text associating the fruitfulness of Leopold's reign with the Eucharist, and that has subsequently disappeared, but Leopold had inscribed himself in this image earlier. This painting, executed by Claudio Coelho between 1685 and 1690, celebrates a sacred relic, another miraculous host, kept in the sacristy at El Escorial. So now I've moved throughout the 17th century. Actually, I'm showing you images from long after the Tapestry series, just to give you a sense of, the Tapestries, the way the Eucharist was so powerfully represented by the Habsburgs. The painting is enormous. It's 5 meters high and 3 meters wide. Its monumentality and Baroque excess magnified by its placement above an elaborate reticule. The painting depicts a room in the front of which we can see an altar. In front of the altar stands the prior of the monastery. Kneeling in front of the father is Charles II of Spain. Members of the court encircle the king. While the painting in general reflects the Habsburg interest in promoting the family's devotion to the Eucharist, more specifically, the painting's subject refers to recent political events in the Escorial. From the time of his father Philip IV's death in 1665 until his 14th birthday, the power in the palace was shared by Queen Regent Mariana of Austria and a group of powerful court figures. Charles was too young to rule. In the 1670s, Mariana grew close to one Ferdinand Valenzuela and gave him a powerful position, to the consternation of court advisors. These advisors thought that when Charles assumed the throne, his mother's pet would be demoted. But they were wrong. In frustration, they threatened Valenzuela, and Charles, in an attempt to protect the man, sent him to the monastery to hide, the monastery at El Escorial to hide, and tasked the prior with hiding him. In an effort to locate Valenzuela, the advisors and 500 troops searched the monastery. They created havoc in some of the most sacred areas of the building, including in the basilica and in the chapel. This was considered an act of heresy by the monks, who excommunicated the royal advisors. Obviously, Charles could not have advisors in a state of excommunication. This is, after all, one of the most proudly Catholic dynasties in history. He therefore asked the Pope, who was Innocent XI at the time, to pardon them. This the Pope did, but with stipulations that the advisors actually rebuild the sacristy and repair the damage they had done. Apparently, Charles actually did that mostly himself, but these are the figures that are represented around Charles, are these advisors. We've talked a fair amount about this picture, so I won't describe it too much, except to remind you that this is the image of the Eucharistic saints, which is the church important figures in the establishment of the doctrine of the Eucharist. And then in the guise of Clare of Assisi, Isabella in the center. Over the course of the 17th century, Habsburgs throughout Europe commissioned images and engaged in practices that would remind subjects of the family's relationship to the Eucharist and that would in turn validate their reign. They generously supported the Feast of Corpus Christi and the 40 Hours devotion, and they commissioned images celebrating their dynastic association with the Eucharist. The triumph of the Eucharist was, in fact, the triumph of the Habsburgs. Many of the Habsburgs represented or referred to themselves in the works they commissioned. Charles II depicted himself with a miraculous relic. Leopold alluded to himself in the image by De Heem. As much as Isabella was relatively self-effacing, her image within the tapestry does put her squarely within the family pattern. At the same time, family members made choices about how and when to be represented that we can think of in more nuanced ways. Each family member's choice of artists, circumstances of commission, as well as the particulars of the work, its style, its medium, or the type of practice it might have been, contribute to distinguish individual family members and their interests and agendas from other family members. It is surely no accident that Leopold, an avid art collector with a penchant for Flemish painting, enlisted De Heem, just to go back quickly to show you, enlisted De Heem, a celebrated still life painter, to execute an independent panel painting of the Eucharist, and this was among several that he commissioned of the Eucharist. As we have seen, Charles II used the miracle host to both make a connection between himself and the sacrament, but as well to make a political statement about the allegiance of his court. Thus, each man distinguishes himself within the family by expressing his relationship to the Eucharist in different terms. The Eucharist makes both a global and a local statement about each Habsburg. Isabella's choice to give tapestries to her favorite convent shows her allegiance quite clearly, and the scholarship mentions this very consistently. And yet it also distinguishes her from her relatives who express their devotion to the Eucharist in other ways. In other words, what I'm pointing out here is that as much as the Habsburgs as a group consistently represent themselves in relationship to the Eucharist, they actually distinguish themselves from one another by the way in which they do so. So devotion to the Eucharist can be manipulated in any number of circumstances, while it always recalls the foundational importance of the sacrament to the family. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for your papers, Anne and Susan. As you both have addressed so well, I think the notion of a distinctly Habsburg idiom and agenda bears heavily upon this series, and yet it's something that scholars don't traditionally address when we talk about the series, particularly when placed in the context of Isabella's upbringing, as you've done, Anne, and within broader Habsburg traditions. As you've done, Susan, the Eucharist cycle emerges not only as a very beautiful and sumptuous series, but also, I think, a tool of persuasion, spiritual, political, or otherwise. Together, I think your papers also bespeak what must have been an extraordinary working relationship between patron and artist. Both were exceptionally devout figures with a sophisticated understanding of theology, but at the same time were very savvy politicians, able to navigate the complex landscape of 17th century Europe. And along those lines of this relationship, I'm wondering, and I'd like to pose this maybe first to you, Anne, but I welcome all to weigh in, our scholars and audience. I'm wondering particularly what her input might have been in specifically the imagery, in light of what you've described as a very sensitive patron, very involved. What do we imagine her involvement may have been in this series beyond just commissioning it?
Oh, I think it's a great question, and I would love to hear some additional thoughts on this. But I imagine a very frank conversation with a man that she's worked with and who's obviously deferential, but has worked closely with her for many, many years, having the ability to articulate some deeply held truths that would be expressed, and having that be a more direct and almost intimate conversation. That, I mean, I'm sure there were required elements for the series, but there's a great deal that's sort of personal that also transforms into a larger political statement. Mm-hmm. So in a way, I mean, I have always felt that the only person that really could have done this series for her would have been Rubens, who was sensitive enough to know how to couch all of these different messages in one single coherent, largely narrative.
I can add to that. I in writing this, I was thinking about that there's in the references to her depiction within this particular image, the scholarship is interesting because it often assumes that that Rubens depicted her in this way without her having much engagement in it. There's this sort of sense that she, as this sort of self-less patron, devoting...
Well, and she doesn't appear in the bozzetto, right? Claire's head is turned.
Yes,
It's
exactly,
not clearly a likeness.
Yeah. But I wonder, given the fact that in the context of this larger issue of the Habsburgs depicting themselves in association with the Eucharist in a way that they really are making sure that they're associated with it visually, whether it's by some sort of inscription or whether it's... there are a number of figures praying to the sacrament, which I didn't show. But I wonder whether there wasn't some discussion about the Habsburg situation as well. I can't imagine that there wouldn't have been, because it seems so clearly part of a necessary conversation, given that so many of her important relatives, and surely Rubens knew the works as well. Yeah. So I think that must have been part of the conversation.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and you've raised that so nicely in the images. Anne, did you want to?
Yeah, I had a question. I wondered, Susan, amongst the sort of body of Habsburg representations, was it common to have someone actually being the bearer of the Eucharist?
That's unusual. That's if I had had much more time, I would have actually talked more about this idea of her being associated with this defense of the Eucharist, and how that actually might be related to Rudolph's originating origins of the dynasty in a kind of Eucharistic miracle, because I think there's something to be said about Isabella being linked to an origin here that can be paralleled to the idea of Rudolph. Like, I think there's actually a lot more to be made of this relationship here. So, yeah, it's unusual.
Yes, Fiona, if you'd actually like to step up to the the microphone, that would be wonderful.
The picture of Rudolph, could we perhaps go back to that?
Yeah, of course.
Yes, I always thought that actually Rudolph's horse is the grey, because it's a much more fiery animal. So, taking up what Anne said about Albert being associated with the grey horse, and I'm wondering, I mean, surely it must have been commissioned in the light of what Susan has said by Isabella and Albert. So I'm wondering whether there's a sort of visual sort of pun going on here.
A prefiguration of Albert,
That's
as it
so
were.
interesting that you say that, because as Anne was going through her images, I was thinking about how that horse keeps reappearing, such that there really is a kind of iconography of that horse. So, yeah, I think that's a great observation. I maybe wouldn't have thought of it, having seen Anne's showing the horse, but I think that's entirely possible, yeah.
And two other small observations. I mean, we already have a painting by Rubens of the Disputa in St. Paul's Church in Antwerp, so he has already engaged in this subject. And then there's a lost Madonna of the Rosary, which shows Isabella and Albert with members of the Habsburg family kneeling in adoration. It was in Brussels.
Oh.
So we also have this idea of the family kneeling in front of the Virgin or whatever.
Yeah. I'll just say to that in taking on this paper, I realized through the middle of writing it that the Habsburg, the kind of iconography of the Habsburg and the Eucharist is really rich, and just in the sense that you bring up these other images that might be brought in, and that there's an entire other kind of body of images and ways in which the material can be shaped that I think would be really, I mean, I can see this being a kind of a large study, actually. I mean, I was thinking of it in the context that I've worked on De Heem and the kind of his relationship to Leopold, but there are a lot of interesting things that could be said about it, I think.
Willem.
I like your description of tools of persuasion, and I think they are that. So why would Isabella ship them to Spain, where there are no heretics, everybody is good Catholic? Why not keep them in Brussels or Antwerp, where they can do a lot more good in PR and advertising for the Eucharist?
You know, that's an interesting question, Willem, and it's something that I was going to ask you also about, and specifically in relation to some other images. You mentioned the idea of appropriation of images for private chapels that have this sort of political message, and the idea of audience, who gets to see these? You know, these images that have such charge, whether or not they're meant to be persuading a public, but if they're not public, I mean, what do we know about who actually gets to see these kinds of images?
I'm sure there are people here who can be very, very specific, but from what I understand, there was, in fact, a very kind of enclosed internal circle that would have seen them, but I think they were outside also periodically. And I think in thinking about this paper, began to really feel that this extraordinary imagery was in a way of Isabella's sort of saying, this is what I'm doing, who I am and what I'm achieving, all the way over here. You know, she's not exactly saying, it's not that she's without support, but certainly she's had to do a lot of things on her own and take initiative. And it's really a way of showing collectively what Habsburg power is about, but also specifically what she is about and what she holds importantly, and that she has the tools to transmit that also. Yes. So in a way, she's speaking to some extremely well-informed family members and court members in Spain about what's happening in the Netherlands.
Excellent. Yeah. Yes, yeah, Betsy, please.
An observation and an off-the-wall question, or one of them. I wondered how much of Isabella's personal devotion to the Eucharist had to do with the continuity of the Habsburg devotion to the Eucharist and her inability to have children, and whether that was her personal way of grasping onto a larger dynastic continuance, if you would. And the off-the-wall question is for Anne, sorry. Among many other things you said that intrigued me, you mentioned that Isabella, quote, evaded a feeble assassination attempt with a plum. And this is a little bit of the clue, Professor Plum in the parlor with a candlestick. Did somebody attempt to assassinate her with a plum, or did she use a plum to foil the attempt? Sorry, I need to know.
I know. I think it's remarkable that here she is, after this long reign, and pretty much most people are pretty happy with what she's been doing. But there was a sort of sector of sort of nationalist folks that I guess tried to organize a way of getting rid of her at the very end, which was, exposed basically and had very little organizational heft to it, and so it's sort of this kind of. I think Isabella and her advisors had a sort of moment of that was pathetic, but we're still here, and it was just sort of a moment at the end of her time, basically, where she still had this kind of spirited ability to, keep back these, still existing, but nonetheless rather small non-supporters in her realm. So.
Yeah. So she had the plum.
She was the plum.
Well, if I could ask another question then, and it's something you just alluded to, Anne, but this is actually for Susan, about the idea that the tapestries could have been outdoors, and I think that's something that Anna will speak to also, potentially where these were actually located, and located at different times even. Because I think the idea of this, the theological rhetoric behind the trompe-l'oeil is fascinating, not only because it does acknowledge what we talked about privately earlier about Aquinas, who is so important at this moment, and the idea that we derive knowledge of the divine not from our intellect, but from something beyond that it's just we can't perceive it by sight. But also that you acknowledge that images have a specific audience and that the viewer activates these images, that by looking at this trompe-l'oeil, by this conceit, we meditate on transubstantiation, on the idea of transformation, miraculous transformation. And specifically, so I imagine decorating these beautiful convent church, people sitting, looking at these, thinking about it, but does it change if they are outside, if you're just sort of walking by, if they're part of a procession and you don't get to spend that kind of time really considering that moment of transformation, or maybe not?
That's an interesting question. I think about them I think the images are so strong, even in their individual, outside of the series, in individual pieces, in terms of the trompe-l'oeil conceit, that I think given the fact that I think probably if you were a viewer, even passing by, having some small engagement with them, you recognize the conceit at some level. I think there has to be some thought about it. In other words, I guess for me, it's not so important that they're as a whole, where you actually understand more clearly how the architectural elements and the tapestries work together, which is a very powerful conceit. That it even works on a smaller level, which is as the individual tapestries. And as we were talking about earlier, and this is something I noticed last night, when I was looking at the images in the room, that when you see the at least the models, now I don't want to call them cartoons, when you see the models in person, the trompe-l'oeil aspects, particularly in some of the foregrounds, are quite striking.
Yes.
In a way that I think it would be hard to miss. So, I mean, I guess if you're talking about, there might be people walking by on the street, but I think with some just slightest bit of attention, you're drawn in. Mm-hmm. And then what you want to do with that in the end is something else. But one of the things that interested me in this topic was that I feel like Rubens is always pulling interpreters in with these very rich iconographic elements. I mean, he's so erudite and everything's so fascinating and interesting in terms of how one might interpret it. And yet here's a work, and there are several others, where there's a very powerful visual kind of device at work that calls for a different kind of thinking. And so that's one of the reasons I wanted to start doing a little bit of work on it.
Well, it's fascinating. I mean, I think it really is adding a new way of thinking. So, are there any other questions from the audience as we approach lunchtime? Great. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Since the official part is over, can we end on a lighter note? And can we do our own tapestry in a tapestry? Can you log on to the simulcast, and can we watch ourselves watching ourselves?
That would be very meta.
Yeah. Well, as Alex said, it is lunchtime. For those of you who are going to Treviso, we have a tram outside to take you there. I also want to mention, as you're coming and going, in the spirit of the symposium, our librarian, Linda McKee, has created a lovely display of works on Rubens, some of them rare, from our collection that are displayed in the windows of the library. So make sure to take a look as you come in or out today. And we'll see you back here. Proceedings will begin again at 1:15.